Welcome back to Organized, the business law breakdown. I'm your host, Seth C. Oranburg, and today we're diving into the detailed world of contract interpretation. We're going to be talking about the canons of construction, which are a set of tools courts use to decode the true meaning behind contract terms when things aren't crystal clear. Imagine this. You sign a contract, and later the meaning of a key term, like emergency services, isn't quite what you thought it was. What happens when both parties have a different interpretation of that same term? Today, we're going to explore how courts read between the lines using established rules to resolve these kinds of disputes. In our previous episode, we discussed how courts interpret contracts based on context and trade usage. Today, we're going a step further, focusing on the canons of construction, specific rules that guide courts in deciphering contract language when ambiguity arises. We'll cover some important rules of contract interpretation, like the plain meaning rule, and we'll focus on finding and resolving ambiguity. Plus, we'll break down real-life examples, such as how courts apply these principles in situations where a term could have more than one meaning. So, if you've ever wondered how courts manage to interpret complex, unclear contract language, stick around. We're about to unravel the strategies they use to ensure fairness in contracts. Now that we've set the stage, let's dive into the canons of construction. These are the rules that courts use to interpret contracts when the language isn't entirely clear. Think of these canons as a set of tools, each designed to help the court, and for that matter, the parties and their attorneys, resolve ambiguity, to figure out what the parties intended, what they actually meant when they drafted the agreement. The first rule courts apply is the plain meaning rule. If the word in a contract is clear and unambiguous, courts simply interpret them according to ordinary everyday meaning. For example, if a contract uses the word car, the court would assume it means a passenger vehicle. And if the contract uses the word vehicle, the court would assume it means any form of transport, unless the contract explicitly narrows that definition. So, if a contract term is unambiguous, courts will apply the plain meaning, but that's often not what parties are disputing. What happens when a term is ambiguous? And by ambiguous, I mean a term is susceptible to reasonable different meanings. That's when the court has to dig deeper. Ambiguity arises when a word or phrase can be reasonably interpreted in more than one way. A classic example might be the word cleave, which, out of context, could mean either to split or to join. Courts use various tools to figure out which meaning the parties intended. There are two kinds of ambiguities courts have to deal with: patent and latent. A patent ambiguity is obvious. Patent means revealed. So a patent ambiguity arises from the text itself, from the four corners of the contract, like when a contract defines a trial period as both 3 months and 4 months in a different section. It can't be both. A latent ambiguity, on the other hand, is hidden and only becomes clear when you look at broader context or external evidence beyond the four corners of the contract. For instance, in one case, the contract referred to a train, but it didn't specify whether it was the express train or the local train that traveled on that route. Without that information in the contract, the court will have to look beyond the text to resolve the ambiguity. When a court encounters ambiguity, it turns to a set of principles known as semantic canons. These include rules like the plain meaning rule, which we already covered. Courts interpret words according to their ordinary, everyday meaning, unless the contract suggests otherwise. Then there's the technical meaning rule. Specialized or technical terms are given their industry-specific meaning when the contract involves a particular field, but only when both parties are in that field and have reason to know the meaning that is given in the industry. The general terms rule says that general terms are interpreted broadly unless the contract restricts their meaning. The negative implication rule, in Latin expressio unis est exclusio alteris, says that the inclusion of specific items implies the exclusion of others that are not listed. If you have a list, be careful to include everything, because if something's not on it, the courts will deem that an intentional omission. The whole agreement rule says that courts interpret contracts as a whole, giving effect to all of its provisions in harmony and preferring meaning for each term that makes sense for the contract in general. The avoid surplusage rule says that no word or clause should be rendered meaningless. All terms should be given meaning, and so a term should not be interpreted in a way that makes some other part of the contract meaningless. The consistent usage rule, which is also called the meaningful variation rule, says that the same word is assumed to have the same meaning when it appears throughout the contract. And, on the flip, a different rule is assumed to have a different meaning. The negotiated terms rule says that handwritten or negotiated terms take precedence over standard boilerplate language. Now, that doesn't mean that you can mark up a document after it's signed. That is just you are writing on a contract, not changing it. But if the parties have gone out of their way to change some of the boilerplate or to indicate with handwriting that they prefer a different meaning than what's written down, the courts will assume that attention to those words signifies their intention to have the handwritten or negotiated meaning. The same class or kind rule, also known as adjustem generis, says that general terms following a list of specifics only applies to items of the same type. The recognition by association, or noscitur associis rule, says that words are interpreted based on their context and associated with the words surrounding them. And the grammar rule, or last antecedent rule, says that generally we apply the rules of English grammar when interpreting contract terms, and specifically, modifiers apply to the nearest preceding term unless the contract suggests otherwise. There's also a concept called the legal meaning rule. We assume that parties write contracts so that courts will enforce them, and so the interpretation that provides a legally enforceable meaning is preferred over a meaning that would make the contract illegal or unenforceable. There are more canons of construction. Depending on who you ask, there could be anywhere from the 12 I mentioned to 60 or 70, and they can be applied in different ways. For example, we can use these canons to interpret statutes and even the Constitution of the United States. But this list provides a basic approach to interpreting contracts for those who are beginning the study. A great example of the use of the canons of construction occurs when a lease agreement prohibits a business from selling quote-unquote liquor. Under the plain meaning rule, the court would likely interpret this term as not pertaining to sales of beer, since liquor typically refers to stronger alcoholic beverages. So the sale of beer and wine should be permitted under that particular lease. The use of the term liquor is given its general meaning and its plain meaning. The key takeaway is courts don't just stop at the words on the page. They apply canons of construction to understand what the parties truly intended, especially when the language is unclear or open to interpretation. They use these canons to disambiguate the ambiguous terms. Now that we've covered the basics of contract construction, let's apply some of these canons to real-life cases, starting with a case that highlights the complexity of interpreting ambiguous terms. Let's break it down with a case that demonstrates how courts handled ambiguity. In this case, we see how the canons of construction help courts decide which interpretation of a contract prevails when there are conflicting meanings. In Inri Motors Liquidation Company, a bankruptcy court faced a tough decision about whether a new company called New GM assumed liability for a car accident that occurred before the company was formed, but where the victim died after the company was formed. The core issue came down to how the contract between old GM and new GM defined the terms accidents and incidents. New GM, who did not want liability, argued that it only assumed liability for accidents that occurred after the date it took over operations, while the plaintiff argued that the death, which happened after the takeover, should count as a separate incident. So the court had to decide whether the word incident could mean the death itself or whether it referred to the original car accident. Both sides had reasonable arguments, but the court ultimately ruled in favor of new GM. The court ruled in favor of new GM by deciding that incident referred to the original accident and not its eventual consequences. How? The court used several canons of construction to make its decision. First, it relied on the plain meaning rule, interpreting incident in the way it's commonly understood, as a distinct event rather than the ongoing consequences of a particular event. The court also applied the rule that says words grouped together in a contract should have related meanings. In Latin, this is noscitur a socius. Words are associated when they're close together. Since the words accident and incident appear right next to each other, the court interpreted them as referring to similar types of events, which can be identified as occurring at a particular time. In re Motors liquidation highlights how courts use canons of construction to resolve ambiguity. When a term could have more than one reasonable meaning, courts look to related words, context, and industry norms to figure out the most appropriate interpretation. Now that we've seen how courts approach ambiguous terms in practice, let's explore a what-if scenario, where two parties disagree on the meaning of a key term in their contract. Imagine you enter into a contract to lease office space, and the lease says the space can't be used for, quote, commercial activities that disrupt neighboring tenants, end quote. You plan to run a consulting business from the office, but after you move in, the landlord tells you that consulting counts as a disruptive commercial activity and you're violating the lease. Can the landlord enforce that interpretation and either cancel your lease or stop you from conducting consulting business? Probably not. Courts would likely apply the plain meaning rule here. The phrase disrupt neighboring tenants is ambiguous, and it suggests some degree of subjectivity. What disrupts one may not disrupt another. But a court would focus on whether a consulting business is reasonably disruptive in practice. Consulting, by its nature, is a relatively quiet and low-impact business. When we think of disruptive business operations, we typically think of that in terms of noise, and not maybe some emotional reaction to the notion of a consultant being nearby. So, unless your specific operations are causing noise or the type of disturbance we might usually associate with this kind of lease, the court might side with you, saying the landlord's interpretation is overly broad and wrong. But let's add a twist. What if the lease also had a clause that defined, quote, commercial activities to include, quote, any service-based business, end quote? Could the landlord then enforce this interpretation? In this case, the landlord's argument does become a little stronger because the lease specifically includes the type of business you're conducting under the definition of commercial activities. Now we include consulting as a commercial activity. However, the court would still need to assess whether your business is actually disruptive. Although now we have some better evidence that the parties intended consulting to be considered as a commercial activity, there's still not evidence here that suggests it's disruptive. So, if your practice doesn't cause actual disturbance, a landlord may have difficulty in proving a violation. And by the way, disturbance should be understood with its plain meaning too, as in terms of noise or some other type of activity which blocks the other businesses from conducting their operations. But let's complicate the situation a little further. What if this consulting business is occasionally visited by large groups of clients, causing immense traffic and filling up the parking lot because the nature of your consulting is to consult with large organizations and to invite hundreds of people into your small office periodically. Now could the landlord enforce the clause? Well, in this situation, the landlord's argument is becoming likely to hold up in court. The increased foot traffic could be considered disruptive to neighboring tenants, and the lack of parking might be a block for the businesses to conduct their operations in that center. Plus, we have already defined your activity as the type of commercial activity that was contemplated. The court might use nuances associates again. It would look at activities listed in the lease to see what counts as disruptive. If other activities involve similar impacts like noise or heavy traffic, then your business might indeed violate the lease. This what if shows how important it is to be clear about contract terms, especially when words like disruptive or commercial activity can be interpreted in more than one way. The more specific the language, the fewer disputes will arise over what the parties meant. Next, let's dive into pop culture and see how contract interpretation issues show up in everyday stories. A great example is from Friends. Joey signs a contract for an acting gig, but doesn't read the fine print. After landing the role of Dr. Drake Ramoray on Days of Our Lives, Joey's character is killed off because of his off-screen behavior. Joey is surprised, but his friends remind him that he didn't read the part of the contract that said the producers could terminate his character, quote, for any reason. While this is a lighthearted moment, it highlights the importance of reading and understanding the terms of a contract before signing. Joey's situation reflects what happens when the terms are clear, but maybe not fully understood. The producers, who probably drafted the agreement, secured the right to kill off the character for any reason, including, of course, Joey's off-screen behavior. Joey just didn't realize the full extent of what he agreed to. In The Office, Michael Scott often signs documents without understanding them. One classic moment occurs when Michael promises unlimited paper to a client, leading to a conflict where the client starts demanding more paper than the company can provide. This is another situation where vague or overly broad terms in a contract can lead to trouble. Had the contract specified limits on how much paper could be provided, the company wouldn't have found itself in such a tough spot. These pop culture examples show that in everyday life, ambiguous or misunderstood terms can lead to unexpected consequences. Whether it's Joey getting killed off or Michael offering unlimited paper, unclear contracts create confusion, and courts are often left to pick up the pieces and apply the canons of construction to disambiguate the meaning. Now let's wrap up today's episode with key takeaways. We've explored how courts interpret contract terms using the canons of construction, a set of rules designed to help resolve ambiguity. Whether it's applying the plain meaning rule or using tools like nuances associates to interpret words in relation to those around them in the contract, courts rely on these principles to determine what the parties intended. In our Break It Down segment, we saw how the court in Inri Motors Liquidation Company interpreted the words accident and incident to resolve a dispute over liability. And we saw that since those words appear near each other, the court believed they had a similar meaning to the parties. And in our What If segment, we explored vague terms like disruptive commercial activities, which can lead to different interpretations depending on the contract's context. The key takeaway here is that ambiguity in contract terms can create major disputes, but courts use specific tools and rules to navigate these murky waters. Understanding the canons of construction is critical for drafting clear contracts and avoiding costly litigation. Have you ever signed a contract where the terms turned out to be unclear or vague? How did you handle it? I'd love to hear your stories or any questions you have about contract interpretation. Share them with me, and you might hear your story discussed in a future episode. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with anyone interested in business law. In the next episode, we'll discuss how courts include context in their analysis of contract meaning and interpretation. Courts look to how the parties acted in this course of performance, course of dealing, and how business operates in terms of usage of trade when evaluating contracts that can't be disambiguated based on the canons of construction alone. That's all for today's episode. I'm Seth C. Oranburg, and I thank you for diving into contract interpretation and looking at the canons of construction with me. I hope you found this useful. And remember, keep your agreement strong and your argument stronger.